Now, this technique is very similar. Actually, my first encounter with it was from the glass process called Millefiori. And when I was still doing glass, which I did for several years, that's where I started doing this. And when I left glass to return to ceramics, I wanted to take this technique with me, and that was when I developed this process in porcelain. One of the significant differences between doing this process in glass and doing it in clay is that in glass I can just stick a punty on either end of this and stretch it as long as it's hot enough. I can stretch it for miles until it cools down. It'd be a challenge to stretch it for miles because it cools down pretty quickly. But the concept is there that the glass will stretch and maintain the same image within the body of this little roll. With ceramics, I can. If I go to stretch this, it's not going to. I can stretch maybe about that far, and then it's going to snap right in two, because it doesn't have the elasticity that glass does. So what I've got to do with it, see, that's where you run into that stuff, is by just trying to stretch it, it's not going to do it. This clay body, as I think I mentioned earlier, actually doesn't have much clay in it. It's only about 25% clay. The rest of it is all non-plastic feldspars and flints. So it doesn't have a lot of plasticity. I can't stretch it much. So what I have to do is just work it and elongate it that way. And that's what I'm doing now, is just kind of pinching it and pulling it and prodding it so that I can stretch it into a little thinner dimension. The challenge is to do it with enough control, because everything will start turning and twisting within the body of this little roll if you're not real careful. Turning and twisting within the body of this little roll if you're not real careful. Okay, so it's stretched. Doesn't take forever, takes, some time, I'd guess. To go from this to this, 15, 20 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, if the clay is working well. But now we've got it in that shape. We've kind of elongated, hopefully kept the relationship and that gradation intact. And then I want a little detailing, so to do that I'm just putting this black slip on. It's the same exact clay body, just with black stain in it. And all I want here is just a little detail line, just something to separate the parts. So that's what this is going to give me. It's just going to be a little micron thick line. And a lot of times people would ask me, well, they'd say, how do you get that line so thin? And this is the way. It's not from rolling it forever. And then, being fundamentally impatient, I blot it dry. I could just let it sit, and it would dry all by itself. But that would require much more patience than I possess. So I blot it dry and speed up the process. And you do want the slip ultimately to end up being about the same consistency as the clay beneath it, which we now have. Now, I think I got this straight. Just start piecing them together. If they're not dry, or if they're too dry, then you end up with this little dilemma where they start coming delaminating. And so I sometimes have to go back and spray them down a little bit. Okay, now to keep that hexagon shape intact would be a challenge, and to keep those lines perfectly straight would be even a greater challenge. If I wanted to do that, I would have to actually start out, if I wanted to keep those lines perfectly straight like that, I would have to probably make this much smaller so that I don't have to shrink it down. Because even if I'm very, very cautious during the shrinking down process, those lines are going to start to shift and twist and turn, and I'm not going to end up with an image like that. That was not my intention in the first place, so I have no need to worry about keeping that as a hexagon. As a matter of fact, I'm planning on turning this into more of a circular format. And you'll see when we're all done that those lines, unless I'm wrong, those lines will probably not look nearly as geometric as they did when we started out. And now we go right back through this process of squeezing it back down again. This is where it's important to keep that slip approximately the same consistency as the clay in the gradation, because if the slip is much wetter than the clay, I won't be able to stretch it down the way I'm doing now. What will happen is the slip lines will slide faster than the clay inside, and I'll end up with parts scooshing out the end, and it'll really mess up the pattern. So it's important to keep it pretty consistent in terms of how wet it is. When you roll it, this has a real significant impact on what goes on inside, and things will twist and turn much more during this rolling process than if I just stretched it out that way. And all of this is just stuff that you encounter and learn as you do it. Usually the first time you encounter it, it's as a mistake, but then from that point on, when you encounter it, it can become a virtue. And just to prove that I'm fundamentally dishonest, I guess, the line stayed perfectly straight. It's not supposed to happen like that, but it sure did. If I wanted them straight, that wouldn't have worked, but there they are, straight as an arrow. Okay, now I've got the basic unit. Now, from that point on, basically what I do with it is turn it into a flat slab, and I can show you how to do that too.